124 British submarines have been lost at sea in time of war, leaving widows to mourn and children to feed. Most of their names and those of their crews have been forgotten, for wartime makes tragedy commonplace. But there was one submarine which sank in time of peace, and even now, 28 years after the event, there are few people who will not recall with bitterness the name of His Majesty's submarine Thetis. At 3 p.m. on Thursday, the 1st of June, 1939, HMS Thetis, with 103 men on board, sank in Liverpool Bay while carrying out a diving trial. The next morning, she was found with her stern jutting out of the water. 4 men escaped, but at 3:10 that same day, she sank once more and disappeared. 99 men were to die. I was the duty officer on the staff of the Commander-in-Chief Plymouth at the time, and I remember the telephone calls coming through from friends and relatives of those on board asking if it were possible to be told of any progress that had been made. There was a nationwide feeling of bewilderment and then of indignation.
As each new submarine is launched to fulfill the needs of a modern navy, it calls for an increasing number of officers and men to perform a difficult and dangerous duty. From the ranks of the Royal Navy, there is never any lack of volunteers. And when disaster overwhelms one of the undersea warships, the world is poorer by the loss of many brave men.
Thetis was launched in 1938 at the Birkenhead shipyard of Camel Laird and Company Limited. She was the third of the new Triton class of submarine ordered in the Navy estimates of 1936. It cost £350,000. The crew of HMS Thetis comprised 5 officers and 48 ratings. The captain was Lieutenant Commander Guy Bolus. He joined his command in June 1938 before the submarine was launched and stood by her during her fitting out. But until her final acceptance trials, she was still entirely the responsibility of Camel Laird's. In April 1939, a certificate was issued by Camel Laird stating that Thetis was fit to undergo her sea trials. So the Thetis left the Mersey for her trial runs in the Clyde estuary. The trials were not a success. The hydroplanes jammed and they couldn't be shifted. And as a consequence, her diving trial was postponed until the 1st of June in Liverpool Bay. Meanwhile, Chief Petty Officer Rokins checked the Davis submarine escape apparatus on Thetis. It was a vital job, but routine. Submariners rarely considered the possibility that one day the drill might save their lives.
They thought, well, it's something, if we have to use it, we'll use it, but you can't say that they were delighted at having to go in the tank. They thought, well, it'll never happen to our submarine, we shan't need it. They thought they'd be far better off in the submarine doing something other in their own department than they would be in our department learning how to save their own lives.
At 9:40 a.m. on Thursday, the 1st of June, Thetis set sail from Birkenhead. She wasn't alone. Admiralty contract requires that the shipbuilders, Camel Laird, should provide an attendant tug during the period of the trial. And they provided Greepcock, steam tug, 160 tons, built in 1935, and manned by a crew of 7. The engineer on board was Arthur Mawson.
Thetis come out of Camel Laird Basin under her own power. And we assisted her down the river, down the rock channel, until she come to the bar ship, which she left us to do her speed trials. And we hung round a bit till she returned. Everything seems to be okay.
Lieutenant Dick Coulthart, an experienced submariner, was also on board the tug, mainly to warn off any passing ships which might stray onto the diving ground. The weather forecast was fair, moderate east wind, sea slight, rather warm during the day. Thetis looked forward to a pleasant trip, especially those on board who were not strictly sailors. There were 7 civilians from the Admiralty, 26 employees of Camel Laird, 5 from other shipbuilding firms, 2 from city caterers of Liverpool who were supplying the luncheon, and lastly, a Mersey pilot. It was expected that some of the passengers would disembark before the submarine dived.
The diving position was reached at 1:30 p.m. By this time, Thetis was 38 miles out of Liverpool and 15 miles slightly west of north from Great Orme's Head at Llandudno.
Greepcock moved in to take off the submarine's passengers, but as she approached, Lieutenant Commander Bolus hailed her through a megaphone. "I shall not be disembarking anybody," he called. "Take station on my port quarter." The diving course will be 310 degrees, and Griebkock did as she was told. Half a mile away, she saw Thetis make preparations to dive.
Diving station, diving station. Open up for diving. Up to 124, 6 point back. Land 0
At 1:40 p.m., Bolus dispatched the formal signal that he was diving for 3 hours. As soon as the message was acknowledged, Bolus left the bridge and clipped the conning tower hatch. He took up his position in the control room and gave orders for Thetis to dive. The time was 2 p.m.
Already touching in total to it. Revolution 360. Revolution 360. Start the telegraph to stop. Good for her, ready for her.
Well, what we could see was she was blowing her tanks, submerging one end, floating again, coming to the surface again, submerging the other end, and surfacing again. And then, after a little while, they just disappeared below the surface. Sudden. Our captain made the remark, well, we all made the remark, my God, she's gone quick. Well, our captain made the remark to Lieutenant Coulthard. He said, she's gone rather funny, hasn't she, sir?
Thetis disappeared at 3 p.m. Lieutenant Coulthard could hazard any number of guesses as to what had gone wrong, if anything had gone wrong. But he was quite unable to offer any immediate help. He had no radio contact with the submarine, and his ship-to-shore link was erratic. Griebkock stopped engines, occasionally going ahead to try and maintain the position in which Thetis was seen to dive.
Lieutenant Coulthard said she may have surfaced somewhere else. Everybody was worried. And he said, we'll leave her a little longer. She may appear yet.
Now, the Thetis's diving program had been quite specific, but nothing included in that program had so far happened. No one had seen the periscope of Thetis, smoke candles, or indicator buoys. Lieutenant Coulthard on the Griebkock was becoming anxious, so he decided to send a signal to the submarine base at Fort Blockhouse. He phrased the signal very carefully. He addressed it to Captain S, 5th Submarine Flotilla, Fort Blockhouse, Gosport, Hants. What was duration of Thetis dive? Coulthard. It was intended to convey anxiety without raising alarm.
At 4:45, the message left Griebkock. At 4:56, it was received at Seaforth Wireless Station. At 5:03, it went to Liverpool. At 5:19, to London. At 5:38 p.m., the message was received at Gosport Post Office, and there it remained for half an hour. The telegraph boy had a bicycle, and the bicycle had a puncture. It wasn't until 6:15 p.m., an hour and a half after it was dispatched, that the message reached Fort Blockhouse.
At Fort Blockhouse, steps are taken to record the time that every submarine dives and the time that she's due to surface. HMS Thetis was due to surface at 5 p.m., so the chief yeoman of signals at Fort Blockhouse began calling her at 5:45. At 5 minutes past 5, no surfacing signal having been received from Thetis, he reported this fact to the duty staff officer. They continued to call the Thetis at 10-minute intervals. There was no reply. But no alarm was sounded because, in the words of the subsequent inquiry, no one wished to imagine trouble because of lack of news of Thetis. So no action was taken until the arrival of the signal from Griebkock, over 3 hours after the submarine had sunk. At 6:22 p.m., the destroyer Brazen, steaming in the Irish Sea and the nearest naval ship, was ordered to swing towards Liverpool Bay.
We were returning to Plymouth, coming down the Irish Sea, when we received a signal to tell us that the Submarine Thetis had failed to surface and that we were to divert and carry out a search for her. And so we at once did this, moving off at full speed to the area off Liverpool where we were told that she was, and we contacted the tug that was standing by her, the Grebe Cock, who gave us a position, but there was some uncertainty as to her precise position, and so we had to start a search.
At 7:25 p.m., the RAF at Abbott's Inch, near Glasgow, were asked to search the area, and 15 minutes later, a flight of 4 Ansons took off. They were given an estimated position for Thetis and told to look for a marker buoy, oil or air bubbles. They were not informed about Grebe Cock.
We arrived over Liverpool Bay on the 1st of June about 9 o'clock, commenced our search for the Thetis, and after we'd been searching for about 20 minutes, I noticed that Slim Avent, who was flying the aircraft over to the west of me, was diving low over the sea. I noticed that below the place he was diving there appeared to be a grey shadow. This didn't have any significance in itself, as it could have been an oil slick or some other disturbance. When I finished my search, I went over and joined Avent, and we flew low over the spot. We noticed a buoy, which appeared to be the submarine distress buoy, by co-pilot who was looking through the bomb hatch. Thought it was red and white, and this was difficult at the speed we were going and closeness to the surface of the sea, and also the light.
It was 9:30 p.m. Thetis had been submerged for 6.5 hours. At 9:40 p.m., a flotilla of 8 of the Navy's fastest destroyers left Portland in Dorset. At 9:45 p.m., the salvage vessel Vigilant left Liverpool. At 10:23 p.m., the RAF's first report reached Brazen. They diverted and investigated, but without finding anything. At 10:53, the revised RAF report reached Brazen, and again the destroyer diverted and investigated, without success. At 3 a.m., Brazen investigated a report of floating oil, without success. Sunrise next day, Friday the 2nd of June, was 10 minutes to 5. There were now 8 possible positions for Thetis. At 7 a.m., Brazen abandoned her search to the south and west of Grebe Cock, took a new course, and at 7:50 a.m., 17 hours after Thetis had gone down, observers spotted what seemed to be a marker buoy. This was unexpected. Most of the search had been concentrated underwater with ASDIC equipment, but what they were looking for was suddenly revealed above the waves.
Suddenly there in the middle of Liverpool Bay, so to speak, was this 18 feet of a submarine sticking out of the water. So we naturally wondered from there what we were going to be able to do. All the chaps in the ship began to wonder now what happens next. Where do we go from here?
Charles Gardner, BBC correspondent, was sent to report on the search, but his commentary was never broadcast.
Well, we arrived on the scene about 9 o'clock this morning. The destroyer, Brazen, was just coming up. A few minutes later, a salvage tug also came up from the opposite direction, and between them, low down on the sea, we could make out a triangular shape, like a shark's fin. At first, we thought this was a marker buoy, possibly from the submarine. But later, well, here is what we recorded at the time.
That signal that you just heard was the signal that we've passed over what we think is the submarine again, and immediately the captain started giving those signals. The destroyer has now lowered a boat, and the boat is rowing across here for all she's worth, and the aeroplane is circling back towards us, and there's another tug coming up towards us. We think we've got something here.
Rescue, it seemed, was a simple matter. Thetis lay 15 miles off the North Wales coast in about 150 feet of water. Her tail stuck out of the sea, and her bows were plunged in the mud on the bottom. Trapped in the hull were 103 men. One of them was leading stoker Walter Arnold.
After we first went down, there was no panic as I know it. I thought, in a case like that, people would be dashing and shouting all over the show, but everything was very calm down there. It was not a disaster as I know it myself. And everybody thought it was just a case of time and we'd be up, talking about going to the dance on the following Thursday.
Leading stoker Arnold was in the pump room, between the mess and the torpedo stowage space.
And the next thing I knew was a terrific rush of air from the forward section of the boat, and there was all foam coming from the torpedo tube compartment. And it was obviously a torpedo tube open to the sea.
In this, the torpedo tube compartment, Lieutenant Frederick Woods had opened the rear door of number 5 torpedo tube. It was a tragic, terrible mistake. The tube was open to the sea and water gushed into the submarine.
Stop it. Stop it. Go 4 men down. Go 1 man down. Go 2 men down. Go 6 men down.
People were shouting from forward to surface, and I heard the air going through the air pipes blowing the tanks, but it still went down at the bows, and it was decided then to close the door, even with the people in the forward compartment. But by that time we were at quite an angle, and the door being a very heavy one, we had to lift it up, and we couldn't get it without a terrific struggle. There was 2 or 3 of us on the door to close it. And as fast as we nearly got it closed, somebody got behind and pulled it open to get out, naturally. Lieutenant Woods and Petty Officer Mitchell were the last 2 out, and when they got out, the water was just about to lap over the door into the next compartment, and had it done so, it would have gone over the batteries and caused chlorine, and that would have been chips for the lot of us.
The bows of Thetis were stuck fast in the mud. Slowly the angle of the submarine decreased until Thetis settled on the seabed. The situation inside the submarine was that the 2 forward compartments were flooded, but this bulkhead sealed off the flooded compartments from the remainder of the boat, which had suffered no damage. The first plan was to go through the forward escape chamber into the flooded compartments and close the torpedo tube door. The first attempt failed. The pressure was too great.
And after a pause, another 2 decided to try the attempt. That was Lieutenant Woods and Smithers. And the same thing happened there. Woods could stand the pressure, but Smithers couldn't. So once again, drained down, emptied the water as it came out, further up the boat, and then there was a 3rd attempt. And after the 3rd attempt, they thought, well, it's hopeless trying to get through that way.
Frank Shaw, a charge hand fitter in 1939, now a foreman in the Birkenhead yard of Camel Laird.
So another discussion took place, and then it was decided to try and lift the stern end of the ship out of the water. This was done by pumping out the oil ballast in the after end of the boat, which could only be done by makeshift pipes, which were scrounged here and there for various systems and bolted together in the best possible manner, and the ballast pumped out. And by about midnight, with the air was beginning to get pretty foul by this time, and the chaps that had been working on the pipes were beginning to feel pretty exhausted. I myself had felt physically, bodily wise, I didn't feel too bad, but I felt that my head was burst, and this is the feeling that I had.
All I was conscious of was being violently sick and headaches and what have you. It was just the struggle for breath, really, that upset most people.
If there had been a normal-sized crew on Thetis, the supply of air would have lasted them for 48 hours. But there were twice the normal number of people on board, and many of them were exhausted with the night's work. To make matters worse, 2 compartments were flooded. The air would last the men in the submarine for only 24 hours. Simple arithmetic dictated that by following the drill, only 2 men could escape every half hour. There was not enough time for everyone to get out. Someone had to escape with a plan for bringing air to the submarine, even though it meant facing the strong and treacherous tides of Liverpool Bay. It was decided that 2 people should make the attempt. Captain Joe Oram, the officer commanding the 5th Submarine Flotilla, and on board to get to know the crew, and Lieutenant Woods, who would be able to explain what had gone wrong. They escaped from the rear escape chamber, now only 20 feet from the surface.
I went over in the whaler to have a look, and as I arrived in this whaler, Captain Oram and Lieutenant Woods arrived on the surface. Then Captain Oram came up first, and we picked them both up and put them in the whaler and took them straight back to the ship. Captain Oram had various instructions tied to his wrist as to what should be done should anyone find his body and where the submarine was. And Woods went up to the bridge and watched the situation. He, in fact, really, I think, wanted to go back to the submarine. They were both quite convinced that there'd then be a steady stream of people coming up all the time.
We decided then that they'd never all get out of the escape hatch 2 at a time, so they said put 4 in, 2 servicemen and 2 civilians. And 2 stokers went in, an apprentice and 1 of Camel Laird's men. And I worked the chamber all the time this was going on, flooding and everything. And the 4 of them went in, and we flooded the chamber up, and nothing happened. All we could see in the chamber was the murky shapes in the water because the hatch was shut on top like. And we gave them plenty of time to escape, and nothing happened. So we drained the compartment down again, and 3 of them were dead, and the other one was in a very bad way. So we had to get the bodies out then, which took us about an hour and a half, 2 hours. A job that you normally would have done in about a quarter of an hour. We were in such a low state. And the bodies we put down below out the way he was just out of sight. And the young lad, the young apprentice, he sat down on the deck, but I don't think he lasted long after that.
I was in the engine room at the time, and the position of the boat was such, it was a very acute angle in the water at this time. So I climbed up into the after compartment where the escape chamber was, and on my way through, one of the chaps that was there handed me a DAC outfit and said, "Yeah, Frank, you may need this."
Lieutenant Chapman said to me, he said, "You go in and take a civilian with you." And he said, "For Christ's sake," he said, "get up there and cheer these lads up."
Anyway, there was a discussion took place as to who was to go out next. Well, Stoker Arnold, I'd known for some time, he decided he would have a go. So I thought, well, if anybody's have a go with, it's the chaps have a go with.
Sure, being a fat fella, his straps wouldn't go round twice, which you want to save your breathing bag from coming up. So I got it and put it on properly for him and tied it as tight as I could at the back, just 1 turn, which did. And he went into the chamber and I said, "Now all you want to do is to push on the hatch." And I said, "When the water comes above your head, just carry on breathing as you are now." He's breathing in his set then. "And leave the rest to me."
We made our escape successful. The hatch opened. I went to the top like a cork, and the first thing I saw when the hatch opened was the sun shining through the water, which to me was one of the finest sights, and still was one of the finest sights I will ever remember.
I went clear of the surface when I came up, and almost as I dropped back in the water, the little boat alongside picked me out. Never gave me time to talk or anything. He just put his sleeve across my mouth, stuck a cigarette in and lit it, and I coughed my lungs up. But it was very nice though, all the same.
Oram and Woods broke the surface at 8 a.m. Arnold and Shaw escaped 2 hours later. After that, nothing. The minutes dragged by. Rescuers surrounding the submarine still hoped for a mass escape and for safety's sake kept clear of the Thetis. Urgent messages were sent to Liverpool for oxyacetylene cutting gear and air compressors, with which it was hoped to carry out Captain Oram's plan for getting air to the trapped men. But time was running out. By 11 a.m., an hour after Arnold had escaped, and with 4 hours of air left, only bubbles and hammering had come from Thetis. The 8 destroyers had arrived from Portland, but all they could do was to stand by helplessly. At 11:30 a.m., a diver tied a guide rope to the conning tower of the submarine. He could do no more because he'd had no previous experience of diving at that depth, nor in such a strong tide. At 1:10 p.m., a strong wire was hooked round the stern and made fast to the salvage vessel Vigilant. The only part of Thetis above water was 18 feet of her stern, containing a tank, Z-tank, on the other side of that bulkhead, crammed with pipes and steering gear. There was a manhole cover in it. Unfortunately, it could only be opened from the inside, and by this time, those left on board Thetis were too weak to do this. Mr. Brock, the wreckmaster from Vigilant, climbed onto the stern of the Thetis and began to loosen the bolts of an outer cover plate, 15 feet above the water. It was about 2:40 p.m. Suddenly, the submarine pivoted on its stem, the tide was pushing her down, and Mr. Brock's rather hazardous attempt had to be abandoned. The state of those inside Thetis was now critical. There seemed only one course of action left. With the oxyacetylene gear, which had by now arrived from Liverpool, the rescuers had to cut a hole in the stern of Thetis. Lieutenant Woods, still shaky from his escape, went from ship to ship pleading for instant action. But while the tug strained to keep the submarine upright, she began to cant. The tow wire snapped, and at 3:10 p.m., Thetis plunged out of sight. At 4:10 p.m. the following day, Saturday, the 3rd of June, the Admiralty announced, "It is regretted that hope of saving lives in Thetis must be abandoned."
Well, I'll never forget anything about the tragedy. My husband went away at 6 o'clock that morning, the 1st of June, Thursday morning. And I knew his schedule for all day. And he was to be home at 12 o'clock at night. And I heard that the news had come over the 6 o'clock news bulletin that the Thetis was missing. And some friends and I went to Camelaird shipyard to find out if there was any information. And there was no news at all. We stayed there until about 10 o'clock at night. And they told us to go home and come back the next day. And meantime, if there was any news at all, they would let us know. So we went back next day. That was the Friday. And we stayed there till about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And a car came in with 4 men who had escaped. And everybody's hopes were raised very much. Even the looks on people's faces were so different. And then about 11 o'clock, an Admiralty car came into the yard, and it had a radio, and everybody clustered round to hear if there was any news. And the news that came on was all hope had been abandoned. And I'll never forget the scenes as long as I live. Women were just going mad. They were screaming and throwing themselves on the ground. Even men were crying on each other's shoulders.
My personal reaction, of course, was very strong indeed. I had some very good friends in Thetis, and I lost some very good friends. The reaction on Merseyside was just the same. Everybody was shocked. They were horrified that such a thing could happen. In fact, they hardly believed it could possibly happen.
The newspapers also expressed this bewilderment and horror. The feeling was so strong that it could not possibly be satisfied by an admiralty or a normal civilian maritime inquiry.
I wish to say how deeply I regret the dreadful accident that has happened to the submarine Thetis. I can say, from what I observed, that everything possible was being done to save the lives of those who were imprisoned in the submarine.
HMS Thetis sank in time of peace. She was beached on the day that war was declared, September the 3rd, 1939. Salvage men towed her to a deserted Welsh beach, and experts crawled over and inside her trying to determine the cause of the disaster. There was no simple answer. The full powers of a tribunal of inquiry were needed.
I think public opinion demanded a tribunal, an investigation. After all, for a whole fortnight, they had almost participated in this disaster. The papers had shown the pictures of this submarine whose crew had worked her so that they'd got half of her breaking the surface. There had been ships all round her, there had been buoys, and then in that ship 100 men had died. The public wanted to know why. They wanted to know why the hell they hadn't been rescued.
At the tribunal, Sir Alfred Townsend Bucknell, one of His Majesty's judges, aided by 3 assessors, heard the testimony of 49 witnesses and that of the 4 survivors from Thetis, including that of Lieutenant Woods. The report, published in April 1940, established that at least 6 facts caused the disaster. 1, the rear door of a torpedo tube was open when the other end was open to the sea. 2, a test cock on the door was blocked with paint. 3, the crew failed to close a watertight door properly. 4, the crew failed to pump water from the flooded compartment. 5, there was no effective assistance from the surface. 6, the crew failed to save themselves by the Davis escape apparatus. Well, the facts seemed simple enough, but on their interpretation depended the livelihood of the dependents of the men who died. Captain Ronald Mills, captain of another T-class submarine, was sent by the Admiralty to make a report on the state of Thetis and to escort the team of lawyers on their examination of the submarine. Better perhaps than anyone else, he understands why Thetis was lost.
In a fully commissioned submarine with a well-trained crew, this operation of submerging to periscope depth is so simple as to seem almost automatic. In fact, an observer would notice the complete silence throughout the submarine, apart from the commanding officer giving the necessary orders. In fact, nothing should happen on board a submarine without the commanding officer being fully aware of what is going on and giving the requisite instructions. And the same sort of thing would occur in a trial dive, except that here the situation is slightly complicated by the divided responsibility between the crew, who are responsible for operating the gear, and the representatives of the shipbuilder, who still retains responsibility for the correct functioning of the equipment. And you can see that this is all right if everything goes well, but should an unexpected situation arise, it is possible with so many experts on board that the commanding officer may not be kept aware of exactly what is going on, and it is here that a dangerous situation may develop.
The Thetis was on trials, and she carried no torpedoes. There are 6 torpedo tubes in this compartment. Normally, there would be 1 torpedo in each tube for peacetime purposes, And so there would have normally been about another 7.5 tons weight in here. And it had been decided, in order to overcome this lightness, they would flood, or rather fill, the 2 lower tubes before they left harbour. That's quite a normal thing to do.
Well, you see these draft marks painted on the ship's hull. Every ship, of course, has them, forward and aft. But in a submarine, they give you a very fair indication of whether the submarine is in reasonable diving condition or whether it's light or heavy forward. And on the day that Thetis went out to do her first dive at sea, the draft marks were recorded, presumably by one of the draftsmen of Camel Lairds. And in fact, the draft marks forward were about 8 inches wrong. In other words, they knew what they ought to be from their previous trial, but in fact, anyone who had looked at them could have said that she was about possibly 8 tons light forward. And it always seemed to me that if only somebody had a look at those draft marks, any one of 100 men, there would never have been any reason to tamper with the tubes, and there would never have been an accident.
Now, when the Thetis failed to submerge properly, it became obvious that possibly number 5 and 6 tubes were not full of water. And so the order came through to Woods to test 5 and 6 tubes. He then proceeded to do this by operating a test cock on the rear torpedo tube door. Now, the test cock operates rather like the tap on a tea urn. If you turn it halfway, water will come out. That is, providing it's not bunged up. But in the event, when we came and examined the rear door of number 5 tube, we found that that hole had been bunged up with paint. By some terrible mischance, the man who had been recently painting out the tubes had left the hole uncovered, and it was stopped up with hard bitumastic enamel, so that the test that Woods made to see whether there was water there or not was invalid. Now, Woods feels pretty sure that these 2 tubes are dry, and so he decides to open them up to see what's gone wrong inside. But before doing this, he wants to make quite sure that the front end of the tubes are shut off from the sea. That is to say, that the bow caps are fully shut. He therefore orders hydraulic power to be put onto the bow caps. And he asks the rating who is operating the bow cap operating lever, he says, "Are bow caps to shut?" And he gets the report, "Bow cap levers to shut." In point of fact, when we came to enter the Thetis, we found that those bow cap operating levers were in a dangerous position. They were neither to shut nor were they to open, but they were in an intermediate position, so to speak, neutral, which would neither make sure that the bow cap was shut nor open. Now, there are, of course, mechanical indicators which show whether the bow caps are open or shut. These are mounted one above the other in between the tubes on the forward bulkhead. But number 5 bow cap indicator is sited at the bottom, and it's partially obscured by pipes, and they're extremely difficult to read. Also, I don't know why, but number 5 bow cap indicator was mounted upside down, and so the needle showing the fully shut position was quite different from the position on the other 5 indicators. However, Woods satisfies himself that these indicators all showed bow cap shut. He then decides to open up each tube in turn. But when he comes to number 5 tube, he finds that the operating lever is very stiff. Now, if the bow cap had crept open during this time, there would be about 3 tons pressure on this door. So no wonder it had been stiff. When he actually forced the door off its seating, water started to come in. The door was flung back, and the sea came in at a rate of 2 tons a second, filling up this compartment, and the ship was lost. what happened next was a matter of seconds. They had to get the watertight door shut if there was to be any hope whatever of saving the submarine. Now, unfortunately, it was not one of the modern, quick-acting watertight doors, but it had 18 butterfly nuts which had to be screwed up. Also, the door was latched open, and apparently they had some little difficulty in freeing it. We know from what we saw when we came on board that in fact they only managed to get one clip on at the top of the door.
This brings us to the next point. Why did the crew fail to pump water from the flooded compartment?
The whole of the forward end of the submarine was open to the sea, with 140-odd tons of water anchoring the bows of the submarine to the bottom. Now, you cannot pump out a compartment which is open to the sea.
It's just the fact that they couldn't stick the pressure that stopped us from coming up. If they could have got through there, shut the door and opened the valves, we'd have been up in half an hour.
Next, why did only 4 men escape? This is what it was like, although this reconstruction at Fort Blockhouse Submarine Headquarters can suggest only the look of the thing. Escape for the submariners inside Thetis was not such a simple matter.
We can only suppose that by this time the crew were in a very advanced stage of CO2 poisoning, the effect of which would produce a kind of euphoria, and the brain would be unable to concentrate upon the simplest action. And I think under these circumstances, the correct functioning of the escape apparatus and the escape drill and the handling of all the equipment round the escape chamber might have proved beyond them, and that something went wrong. All we know from the evidence of the divers in their examination afterwards is that the escape hatch between the chamber and the sea was found jammed partially open. The divers also found that the door between the escape chamber and the engine room was open, and we can only suppose that at some time in the afternoon around 3 o'clock this door was accidentally opened, in which case, of course, the water would pour through the half-opened hatch and would flood the engine room, and indeed would flood the entire submarine.
And lastly, the would-be rescuers. Why, in the words of the tribunal, was there no effective assistance from the surface, where 9 destroyers, 2 salvage vessels and 2 tugs clustered helplessly? Greebcock lost the position where the submarine disappeared because she wasn't equipped with a marker buoy. What's more, her anchor chain was too short, and by the time that she'd shackled up enough chain to secure herself, she drifted 4 miles from where Thetis went down. This is why she saw none of the submarine's distress signals. Greebcock's position misled Brazen and Vigilant, so they began searching in the wrong place, and the confusion was made worse by air reports of a distress buoy and other seemingly suspicious signs, none of which, in fact, had anything to do with Thetis. The result was that the submarine was utterly lost until her tail was seen jutting from the water the next morning. The rescuers then made the most disastrous mistake of all, to stand away and await a mass escape from Thetis. This, as we know, never happened, and by the time that alternatives were considered, all hope had gone. But there were other would-be rescuers. Robert Ostler, the engineer of Tarku, another submarine being built at Camel Laird.
It seemed obvious to us
that with all the horsepower in the destroyers on the site, that cables could have been put through the A brackets and the ship towed into shallow water, pumping the air at the same time to the men and making it easier for them to get out.
Chief Petty Officer Rokins, a specialist in Davis submarine escape apparatus, had flown up from Portsmouth.
Chief Petty Officer Howard and myself went over in an old flying boat and we flew overland. Howard and I both volunteered to go down using DSEA. Our idea was to get inside. Howard worked the chamber from the outside while I was inside with 1 or 2 men, and allow them to escape, close the hatch, drain the chamber down, put another 1 or 2 in, and then I would work the chamber and Howard would go inside with the men. But this was refused. They told us that we'd no chance whatever of getting inside the submarine.
The naval divers in HMS Tidworth were still only in the Firth of Clyde. Jack Diamond was amongst them.
Well, if we'd have been flown after our first request, I feel sure that we could have carried out the full request of the captain of the Thetis, which was to connect the air hose to the recuperator connection at the position on the gun. So I could have connected an air pipe to the external connection to feed the internal line of the submarine. And all the messages that were sent up by Captain Horan, we could have completed within half an hour whilst the crew were still alive in the submarine.
These were personal projects which were never tested, but the tribunal had this to say. If those in charge of the salvage operations from the time when the stern came into view had concentrated their efforts on holding it up out of the water and in getting oxyacetylene gear as soon as possible to cut a hole in the stern, more of the men might have been saved.
With this mass of information before them and ample indications of negligence, the dependents of the men who died in Thetis naturally turned to the law for compensation.
Speaking for myself, and I think for every other lawyer, including the Crown lawyers who were engaged, I don't think that there was any one of us who had any doubt at all that any question remained except how much. A certain amount of question whether it should be Camel Laird's or the Admiralty or what sort of proportion between the two.
It wasn't a question of sentencing anyone, but merely of deciding who should be compensated and by whom. The case, known as Duncan and Others versus Camel Laird and Others, was first heard before Mr. Justice Wrottesley, who considered that Camel Laird were negligent, since they'd failed to notice that the test cock was blocked. Camel Laird appealed, and in 1944, the 3 judges of the Court of Appeal unanimously took quite a different view of the evidence. They considered that the cause of the accident was Lieutenant Wood's failure to make proper use of the lever controlling the bow cap. There remained the verdict of the House of Lords. 5 law lords headed by Lord Simon. In 1946, 6.5 years after Thetis was sunk, they came to yet another conclusion. The most extraordinary decision that no one was to blame.
If it be thought remarkable that after so long and elaborate an investigation, no one should have been found liable for this loss of life, the answer is that in order to recover damages, it is necessary to prove liability against one or other of the parties sued. The key to what is uncertain may have been lost among the 99 who perished in the disaster.
The whole trouble was in the particular atmosphere. There were so, of wartime, when this came to trial, there were so many widows every day whose death had been the deliberate action of enemy, not anybody's negligence. But it just didn't seem fair that those who had died because of negligence should be compensated on a quite different scale to those who died because of a deliberate action of the enemy. That's what I think got into the mind of the House of Lords.
Their lordships considered that whatever the extent of Camel Laird's negligence, that negligence had not caused the accident, legally speaking. As for Lieutenant Woods, they decided that an officer so gallant, careful, and experienced could not possibly have made a mistake.
Lieutenant Woods was obviously a scrupulously truthful witness, and the learned judge had no hesitation in accepting his account of his actions before he opened the rear door.
The dependents, Duncan and Others, had failed to prove whose negligence had caused the accident. So they not only failed to recover any damages from anyone, but they were presented with a bill for £36,000. It's at this moment that one suddenly remembers with a sense of shock that this Duncan is Mrs. Rose Duncan, whose husband died in the Thetis.
Well, I just had to come home again. I had a little money we'd managed to save. Too, I had to go to stay with my mother-in-law for a week or two. And then I started to work. And my husband's firm, they gave me some money to help me on a bit. After 6.5 years, the House of Lords turned down our case. We had lost everything. We had nothing at all. We just felt we had absolutely forgotten about. Nobody seemed to care about us at all. Those who were able to work just had to work. We got no financial aid at all, apart from the Thetis Fund, which they were very, very good to us.
While the law was taking its course, Thetis had been raised, renamed Thunderbolt, and after a short but distinguished career had been sunk by enemy action in the Mediterranean. All on board were lost. But this was a wartime disaster. There was no need for an inquiry. Frank Shaw and Walter Arnold, who escaped from Thetis, are still alive. So is Captain Oram, now retired from the submarine service and living in London. Lieutenant Woods, who opened the door to number 5 torpedo tube, was killed in a car crash in 1946. But there are many other people who still remember HMS Thetis. Mrs. Duncan, whose bill for legal costs of £36,000 was paid by the trades unions. There are other widows who were granted a weekly pension of £1 with an additional 7 shillings and 8pence for each child. And there is the Navy, whose legacy from the Thetis disaster was an improved bulkhead door, a Thetis clip on torpedo tube doors, and a knowledge, which was to save lives in the future, of how men can survive under perilous conditions. There is no way of assessing such a balance sheet, but 28 years after HMS Thetis died in Liverpool Bay, the Admiralty still regrets.